When an ordinary traffic check unexpectedly turned into a defining moment in someone's career, an officer's deepest assumptions collided with a truth he could never have predicted. His focus was on the very man whose presence would shape his future. The sun was beginning its evening descent over the streets of Sacramento, tinting the sky with brilliant hues of gold and amber. Jake Coleman was driving home after a long day at work. His sedan produced a soft hum as he adjusted the air conditioner, determined to shake off the stress of the day. The radio played quietly in the background, offering a gentle counterpoint to the lively city streets. Jake approached an intersection with a yellow light, slowing down right as it turned red. In that moment, flashing blue and red lights burst into view behind him, accompanied by the sharp blast of a police siren. Glancing into his rearview mirror, Jake's brow furrowed slightly as he pulled over to the shoulder of the road. He rolled, his window down just as a patrol car came to a stop behind him. From the vehicle stepped Officer Luke Turner, a man in his mid-30s, sporting a neat buzz cut and a badge that shone on his chest. Adjusting the strap of his duty belt, Luke walked confidently toward Jake's car, exuding the assurance of someone used to calling the shots. "License and registration," Luke demanded, in a curt tone that carried a subtle but clear air of authority. Without a word, Jake reached into his glove compartment, handed over his driver's license and registration, and maintained a calm and measured demeanor despite feeling Luke's critical gaze assessing him as though looking for any excuse to investigate further. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Luke asked while leaning toward the open window. "I'm not completely sure," Jake answered evenly, his tone polite but resolute. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the signal." There was a brief moment when a note of uncertainty crossed Luke's voice, and as Jake nodded in slight acknowledgement, it was clear that this was no longer going to be a standard routine check. Rather than moving on, Luke lingered, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Jake more intently. It became apparent that this stop had escalated beyond a simple traffic violation, with a barely perceptible change in his stance. As if he had already decided that this matter was significant, the officer glanced at the identification in his hand. "You're not originally from around here, are you?" he inquired. After a brief pause, Jake replied, "I moved here just a few months ago. My address is printed on the license." Yet it seemed Luke was no longer interested in routine. Procedures. His tone turned sharper, hinting that he was probing for something more. Jake's calm and steady manner seemed to unsettle Luke even further, who inched closer. "Where were you off to in such a rush? Just heading home, I suppose." Jake responded, with equal calm, though the subtle shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. Luke no longer viewed Jake merely as a driver. He saw an element of suspicion that he couldn't ignore. Jake sensed the mounting tension, but held his composure. What appeared as naivete was in fact a deliberate display of control. This encounter was only just beginning. With deliberate slowness, Luke took a step back and folded Jake's documents before slipping them into his chest pocket. His face transformed into a smug expression, as if he had already passed judgment on the man before him. "Step out of your vehicle," he ordered. For an instant, Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened, though his expression remained unreadable. "Is there any particular reason for that, officer?" he asked in a measured tone. Luke's lips twitched momentarily before he replied, "I told you to exit the car. I don't want to complicate things any further." Although unspoken, the threat in his words was palpable. Jake exhaled steadily and opened the door to step out. Luke's eyes quickly swept over him as he sized him up. Jake stood a little taller than the officer, with broad shoulders that contrasted with his calm and non-threatening demeanor. His well-fitted suit spoke of professionalism, and his polished shoes hinted at attention to detail. Yet none of those attributes seemed to matter in this moment. Luke motioned toward the front of the car, saying, "Place your hands where I can see them." Jake obeyed with slow, deliberate movements. "Is there something specific you're after, officer?" he inquired. With a faint smile, Luke replied, "It's just routine. We've had some incidents nearby lately. Better to be safe than sorry." Jake turned his head, locking eyes with Luke. "Incidents with men in suits driving sedans? Or is there another reason behind all of this?" That question hit Luke like a slap, causing his confident posture to waver as his hand drifted toward his belt in a reflexive manner. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question." Jake, with quiet firmness and no sign of defiance, maintained his steady composure. Leaning even closer, Luke's eyes narrowed further as he asked, "You seem very familiar with how these stops work. Got something you're hiding?" Jake let silence linger for a moment before responding, "No, officer, I just value being upfront about why we're interacting. It's all about transparency." Luke scoffed silently, took a small step back, and began pacing in a small circle in front of the car. The atmosphere was shifting in ways Luke didn't quite grasp. Jake's reaction was not that of a nervous or frightened driver. Instead, his calm and poised presence only heightened Luke's unease. "You appear pretty confident," Luke muttered, almost to himself, as if to challenge, "like you already know what's coming next." Jake simply tilted his head slightly in reply, "Confidence isn't what matters here, officer. Respect does." For a brief moment, Luke froze before turning back to face him, as if the earlier haze of arrogance had been replaced by something more defensive. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words emerged. Jake's unshaken composure was throwing him off, and the prolonged silence made the tension feel almost electric. Luke was beginning to realize that this encounter might not unfold as he had anticipated. Instead of retreating, Luke doubled down. The true test had only just begun. He tapped his fingers on his belt holster with barely hidden frustration. Clearly, unaccustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jake. His eyes shifted back to the car, as if searching for a justification that he had yet to fabricate. "Turn around and rest your hands on the hood," he ordered in a clipped tone. "I need to check for weapons." Jake arched an eyebrow and responded, "Weapons? Do I really look like I'm carrying any?" Luke's jaw tensed, and for an instant, his confident mask cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again," he stated firmly. After a moment's pause, a moment when something unreadable passed over his features, Jake quietly complied, placing his hands flat against the hood of his car. Luke approached with the sound of his boots crunching on the asphalt, breaking the heavy silence. In a series of brisk, rough movements, he patted Jake down, his hands lingering far longer than necessary. This was not merely a search, it was an assertion of dominance meant to provoke a reaction. Yet Jake neither flinched nor tensed in response to the intrusive inspection. "You're clear," Luke grumbled, stepping back with a begrudging tone, as though annoyed he had found nothing incriminating. Jake faced him, his expression calm and his eyes sharp. "Naturally I am," he responded succinctly, and then added, "Officer, if you're finished, I am not done yet." Luke, his voice slightly raised, blurted out, "You seem to know a lot about what I can and cannot do. Care to explain yourself?" Folding his arms, Jake looked relaxed, despite the crackling tension between them. "I've had my share of run-ins with law enforcement," he said evenly. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Luke's eyes narrowed further as he inquired, "So, are you some kind of lawyer or something?" Jake gave a faint smile and replied, "Something like that." The ambiguous remark only seemed to irritate Luke more as he stepped closer, invading Jake's personal space, his tone dropping to nearly a growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me, that you can talk your way out of this?" Jake met his gaze without wavering. "I don't think I'm above anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing any of it here." The words hung in the air like a direct challenge, and Luke couldn't help but take the bait. "Fairness? So you really think fairness is involved here? People like you always—" he began, but stopped abruptly, as if his intended words were burning his tongue. Without changing his expression, Jake repeated softly, "People like me." His voice was gentle yet filled with meaning. Luke bristled, stepping back as if he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "You know what I mean?" he muttered weakly, his tone losing its earlier certainty. "I believe I do," Jake replied quietly. His calm was no longer passive, but sharp as a blade, slicing through any pretension. "And we both know this interaction stopped being about a routine traffic check quite some time ago." Luke opened his mouth to respond, but was left silent, uncertainty clouding his features for the first time. The power balance was unmistakably shifting, placing Luke on unstable ground. Yet, the moment of truth was still looming, one he would not easily forget. Breaking the heavy silence, Jake stated firmly, "Officer, it's time you knew who I am." Luke's brows knit together as irritation flared. "I don't care who you are," he fired back, though a slight crack in his tone betrayed his discomfort. Slowly reaching into his pocket, Jake said calmly, "I'm getting my badge." As Luke's hand twitched closer to his holster, Jake continued, "No need for theatrics. I want you to see this." His words resonated as he pulled out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a glistening badge. "I'm Jake Coleman," he introduced casually as if greeting a neighbor, head of internal affairs for the Sacramento division. For a moment, Luke froze. His eyes darted back and forth between the badge and Jake's unyielding face, searching for any hint that this was a joke. There was no humor in Jake's look, only a quiet command and a tinge of disappointment. "Internal affairs," Luke repeated, his voice slightly trembling. "Yes," Jake interrupted, sparing him the effort of finishing his sentence. "I am responsible for overseeing officer conduct. My duty is to ensure that those entrusted with this badge maintain the integrity and values it represents." Luke's face turned pale, and his once assured demeanor crumbled before his eyes. He took a small backward step, his hand slowly dropping, away from his belt as though suddenly burdened by his own authority. Closing the small gap between them, Jake asked in a calm yet piercing tone, "Do you know what is most disturbing about this encounter, Officer Turner?" He continued steadily, "It isn't just the profiling, which is troublesome enough, nor is it the senseless escalation. It's that you acted all of this out without realizing who you were really dealing with. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights or understand the very laws you're supposed to enforce." Luke opened his mouth to protest, but no words formed. Jake's stare remained unrelenting as he finished. "Because I never fit your narrow definition of someone worthy of respect." His words were not angry, but they carried the weight of a strong indictment. "And this isn't only a problem for me, officer. It's a problem for everyone who comes into contact with this uniform." Luke's shoulders slumped under the full impact of Jake's words. He glanced down again at the badge in Jake's hand, as if hoping it might vanish if he looked away. Jake stepped back, giving him a moment to process, but his tone stayed firm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step back, return my documents, and choose your next words. Very carefully." Luke parted his lips, hesitating as he contemplated whether to resist or comply. That brief pause cost him dearly, and Jake lowered his voice slightly, adding, "You will hear from me again, not as the driver who was pulled over on the side of the road, but as the person charged with determining whether you deserve to wear that badge." Luke swallowed, his face flushing as the gravity of the moment set in. He reached into the inner pocket of his chest and retrieved Jake's driver's license and registration, his hands trembling a bit as he handed them over. Jake accepted them without a word, carefully tucking them into his wallet. Moving toward the driver's door of his car, he paused with one hand on the handle and cast one last, steady look back at Luke. "Remember this, Officer Turner. The badge doesn't elevate you above anyone. It only makes you answerable to every person. As Jake slid into his car and started the engine, Luke was left standing in the waning light, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. For Jake, however, this was only the beginning. His next move would send ripples through the whole department. The ride home was quiet, though Jake's mind was far from calm. He replayed the encounter over and over, not because it was unique, but because it was alarmingly typical. Luke wasn't the first officer Jake had encountered like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. Yet this time, things were going to change, for Jake now had the power to act. The next morning, Jake sat at his desk with the early sunlight filtering through the blinds in his office at the Sacramento Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open before him, Officer Luke Turner. Although his record wasn't entirely unblemished, markings of unprofessional conduct, too many unnecessary stops, and vague incidents that had never been properly addressed, Jake leaned back, steepling his fingers as he pondered the broader implications. Luke was not an isolated case. He was a symptom of a much deeper issue, and Jake had no interest in merely placing a bandage on a festering wound. A knock interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant, Maria, entered with a stack of reports in her arms. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases, and by the way, the chief reminded me about the departmental review next week." Nodding in acknowledgement, Jake accepted the files. "Thank you, Maria. Could you also arrange a meeting with the chief for this afternoon? I need to discuss something important with him." Maria hesitated briefly, sensing the weight behind his words, then replied, "Certainly," before leaving the room. Returning his attention to Luke's file, Jake realized his focus was not solely on one officer. It was on the entire culture that allowed behavior like Luke's to be acceptable. And if there was one thing Jake understood, it was that such culture began at the very top. That same afternoon, Jake found himself sitting across from the department chief in a small conference room. The chief, a seasoned veteran with hair streaked with grey and an unmistakable no-nonsense air, leaned back as he listened intently while Jake recounted the entire traffic stop. "I could have dismissed this as just another awkward encounter," Jake said steadily, "but that would have been a grave mistake. Luke's actions are not isolated. They are a clear sign of the work we still must undertake." The chief rubbed his temples and exhaled slowly. "This isn't the first time Luke Turner has come up," he admitted. "We've always handled such issues quietly, and that is exactly the problem." Jake responded firmly, "Quiet won't mend anything. Quiet only lets these problems persist. It's time to speak up." The chief looked at him intently, the seriousness of the conversation etched on his face. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A full departmental review," Jake stated without hesitation. "Not only examining individual units, but also overhauling our training, protocols, and accountability systems. We cannot continue to sweep these problems under the rug. If we refuse to hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can the public ever trust us?" The chief leaned forward, hands clasped together on the table, and said, "You're going to stir things up a bit with this approach, and that is a good thing." Jake simply nodded. It's about time someone took this step. The following weeks became a blur of meetings, interviews, and countless reports. Jake worked relentlessly, gathering data, talking with fellow officers, and even hosting public meetings to hear directly from the community. The incident with Luke Turner became a turning point, a catalyst forcing the department to confront its deep-seated issues head-on. For his part, Luke had to face an internal hearing. Jake made no secret of his role, sitting across from Luke during the process and observing as the officer visibly squirmed under intense scrutiny. While the hearing ended with a suspension, Jake knew the true victory lay not in punishing Luke, but in preventing another incident like his. Months later, Jake stood at a community event podium, addressing an audience filled with fellow officers. city leaders, and local residents. He spoke not about placing blame, but about shared responsibility, a collective duty to build a system that worked for everyone. His speech was more than a call for accountability. It was a promise of real change. "Justice isn't merely about catching wrongdoers," Jake proclaimed, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about ensuring that those entrusted to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every individual they encounter. This is the badge I believe in, and it is the badge we are building together." The applause that followed was resounding, but Jake did not dwell on it. For him, this moment marked not an ending, but the dawn of a new chapter. As he stepped down from the podium, Jake glanced across the room at faces filled with a mix of skepticism and hope. He understood that change wouldn't come immediately, but it was inevitable, and for now, that promise was enough. If this story strikes a chord with you, pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. Let us ignite the discussions that spark meaningful change and push us all toward a better future.